It happened on a grey morning in the spring of 1947 in a stone friary on a hill in southern Italy. A young Polish priest, thin and unknown, climbed the steps before dawn. He had crossed half a continent to kneel in a small wooden confessional. On the other side of the screen waited an old friar with bandaged hands, hands that had bled for almost 30 years. The young priest knelt. The friar looked at him through the lattice, and before the young man spoke a single word, the old man already knew who he was and what he would one day become. The young priest was named Karol Wojtyla. The world would later know him as Pope John Paul II. The old friar was named Padre Pio. What passed between those two men in that small dark room has been whispered about for nearly 80 years. And tonight, after the events of these last weeks in Rome, those whispers have returned. Because a pope has knelt before the whole world and asked for pardon, and the faithful are asking a question they cannot let go of. Did the friar with the wounded hand see this coming? Did he know, long ago, that the Pope would one day humble himself before God and before history? Stay with me, because what is real here is stranger and more beautiful than any legend. And if these stories of the Church's hidden saints stir something in you, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments what country you are watching from tonight. It matters to know we are praying together. Now let us return to the friar on the hill. To understand the prophecy, you must first understand the man. And the man was not what the world expected of a saint. He was born Francesco Forcioni on the 25th of May in the year 1887 in a poor farming town called Pietrelcina. His family worked the soil. They were not learned. They were devout in the old way, the way of candles and rosaries and long walks to a small church. As a boy, Francesco was sickly and quiet. He spoke of seeing things others could not see. He spoke of conversations with figures no one else could hear. His mother did not know whether to be frightened or to fall to her knees. At 15, he entered the Capuchin order and took a new name. From that day, he was Pio, Brother Pio. He was ordained a priest in the year 1910. And almost at once, something began to happen to his body that the doctors could not explain and the church could not ignore. Wounds appeared on his hands, on his feet, in his side. The same wounds in the same places that Christ received upon the cross. The church calls this the stigmata. For a time the wounds came and went, but on the 20th of September, in the year 1918, while he was praying alone in the choir loft of his friary in San Giovanni Rotondo, the wounds opened and did not close again. They would stay with him for 50 years until the day he died. Think on that. 50 years. Half a century of bleeding hands. He celebrated Mass with those hands. He wore dark gloves to hide them when he was not at the altar. The blood was real. Doctors examined him. Skeptics came to expose him and left in silence. And those who came near reported something they could not explain. A scent, a fragrance of roses and violets that drifted from the wounds, though no flower was near. The faithful called it the perfume of Padre Pio. Some claim they smelled it from across the world in moments of crisis, as if the friar were somehow present. But the wounds were only the beginning of the mystery. Because Padre Pio could see, not with his eyes, with something deeper. Men and women came to his confessional from every corner of Italy and then from every corner of the earth. And again, the same thing happened. Before the penitent could speak, Before they could open their mouth and confess, the friar already knew. He named the sin they had come to hide. He named the year, the place, the very thing they had buried in the deepest part of their soul and never told another living person. Some fled the confessional in terror. Some he turned away at the door, refusing to absolve them until they were truly ready. He did not flatter, he did not soften. He saw straight through the mask that men wear, down to the trembling truth underneath. This is what the Church calls the reading of souls. And it is why, when this man spoke of the future, people did not laugh. They listened, they wrote it down, they remembered. You should know, too, that the Church did not embrace him easily. For years the friar lived under suspicion. There were those in Rome who believed his wounds were a fraud, or worse, a kind of theater. He was investigated, he was watched. For a long stretch of years, he was forbidden to celebrate Mass in public, forbidden to hear confessions, kept silent and hidden away, while men in distant offices debated whether he was a saint or a deceiver. He bore it without complaint. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply obeyed and waited and prayed and bled. And when the suspicion finally lifted, the crowds came back larger than before. There is a lesson in that silence, and we will return to it before the night is through. A man falsely accused who answers only with patience tells you something about the kind of holiness that does not need to be seen to be real. So now we return to that gray morning in 1947 and to the young Polish priest on the steps. Karol Wojtyla was nobody then. A student, a survivor of a country crushed beneath the boot of war. He had lost his mother as a child, his brother, his father. He had worked in a quarry and a chemical plant under Nazi occupation. He had studied for the priesthood in secret, by candlelight, knowing that to be discovered meant death. And now he had come to Italy to continue his studies, and he had heard of the friar who bore the wounds of Christ. So he came. He confessed, and by every account that survives, that confession lasted not minutes, but the better part of a week of returning, of speaking, of being seen. Here we must be honest, the way the faithful should always be honest. There is a story, repeated for decades, that Padre Pio looked at the young Wojtyla and said plainly, "You will one day sit on the throne of Peter. You will be Pope. But I see blood. I see violence upon you. It is a powerful story. It races through the heart." And yet, the man himself, once he became John Paul II, denied it more than once. He said it never happened that way. He was a careful man, and he would not let a legend grow in his own name. So we will not pretend. We will not put words in the mouth of a saint. What the faithful claim and what can be proven are two different rivers, and an honest soul must know which one he is drinking from. But here is what can be proven. Here is what is documented in letters, in records, in the testimony of those who were there. And it is, in truth, more extraordinary than the legend. Years later, in 1962, Karol Wojtyla was no longer an unknown student. He was a bishop in Poland, and he had come to Rome for the great council that would reshape the church. And a woman he knew was dying. Her name was Wanda. She was a mother of 4 young daughters. She had survived a concentration camp in the war, only to be struck now by cancer, given up by the doctors, sliding toward death. The bishop did not call a hospital. He did not call a specialist. He sat down and wrote a letter to an old friar with bleeding hands, a man he had knelt before 15 years earlier. He begged Padre Pio to pray. He described the dying mother, the 4 daughters, the camp she had survived, the mercy he was pleading for. The letter was carried to San Giovanni Rotondo and placed in the friar's wounded hands. Padre Pio read it, and then he spoke words that those present never forgot. He said, "You cannot say no to this," and he promised he would pray. Days later, the dying woman was wheeled toward the operating room for surgery that her doctors believed she could not survive. They examined her one last time before the knife, and the cancer was gone. Not shrunken, not slowed, gone. The ulceration that had been eating her alive had simply vanished, leaving only a faint redness where death had been. There was no surgery. She rose from that bed and lived. She lived, in fact, to be over 100 years old, and she remained for the rest of her life a friend and counselor to the man who had written that letter. The man who would become John Paul II. Now hold these two saints in your mind together. The friar who could not say no, and the bishop who would one day kneel at his canonization. Because there is one more detail, and this one cuts to the heart of everything. When the young Wojtyla had knelt before Padre Pio all those years before, he is said to have asked the friar a question. Of all your wounds, he asked, which one causes you the greatest pain? The world assumed it was the hands, where everyone could see the blood. But Padre Pio answered something no one expected. It is my shoulder, he said. The wound on my shoulder, where no one knows, where it has never been treated or healed. A hidden wound, a wound the public never saw, a wound he carried alone. And here is the thing that historians of his life have noted. After studying everything written about Padre Pio, every account, every record, it appears that Karol Wojtyla may have been the only living soul the friar ever told about that secret shoulder wound. Of all the thousands who came to him, he opened that hidden pain to the young Paul, as though somehow he knew this one was different, as though he knew where this young man was going. The friar died on the 23rd of September in the year 1968. His wounds, the doctors said, were suddenly clean, healed, without scar, as though the 50 years of suffering had been lifted from his body in the final hour, the debt paid in full. He was made a saint on the 16th of June in the year 2002. And the man who raised him to the altars, the man who declared to the world that the friar of the bleeding hands was now Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, was none other than Pope John Paul II, the unknown priest from the steppes, the bishop who wrote the letter, the one to whom the saint had whispered his hidden wound. He had become Pope exactly as the legend claimed, and he stood over more than 300,000 of the faithful and gave the friar his crown. So the connection between Padre Pio and the papacy is not invented. It is woven into the very flesh of the Church's recent history. A saint who could read souls, a young priest he saw clearly, and a throne in Rome that one of them would climb. Which brings us at last to these last weeks and to the question burning in so many hearts tonight. Because in the year 2026, a new pope sits on the throne of Peter. He took the name Leo, Pope Leo XIV. He is the first pope born in the United States, a son of Chicago, a man whose own family tree, it is said, holds within it both those who were enslaved and those who once held others in bondage. And on the 25th of May, this pope did something that no pope before him had ever done in quite this way. He knelt in spirit before the whole world. He acknowledged the Church's own role across the centuries in giving cover to the chains of slavery, in lending sacred words to a great and terrible wrong. and he spoke words that echoed around the earth. In the name of the church, he said, I sincerely ask for pardon. He called it a wound in Christian memory. A wound, the same word. A pope speaking of a hidden wound in the body of the church and asking the world's forgiveness for it. Understand what this apology actually touched, because it was not a small thing. For centuries, men had pointed to old documents, old decrees, old words once spoken in the name of the church, and used them to justify the buying and selling of human beings, the breaking of families, the chaining of the innocent. Other popes before had expressed sorrow for what Christians had done, but this was different. This pope reached back into the oldest record of the institution itself and named the wound there, in the marrow, in the memory. He did not blame others. He took the burden onto his own shoulders, the way a son takes responsibility for the sins of his father. And he did it knowing that his own bloodline, the very family that carried his name, held within it both those who had been bound in chains and those who had held the chains. He spoke not as a stranger to the wound, but as a man who carried it in his own flesh. Now you see why the faithful cannot stop talking, why the old stories of Padre Pio have come roaring back. Because here was a friar who carried a hidden wound for 50 years, who knew the popes before they were popes, who saw a young man rise toward the throne. And now a pope kneels and names a hidden wound and begs the world for pardon. Let us be honest once more, for honesty is the only ground worthy of a saint. There is no letter in any Vatican archive where Padre Pio writes down the name Leo. There is no recording of him saying a pope by that name would one day apologize to the world. If anyone tells you such a quote exists, word for word, ask them to show it to you, and they will not be able to. We do not honor the friar by inventing words he never spoke. That is not faith. That is fog. But here is what is true, and it is enough. Padre Pio spent his life telling the world that the church is not a museum of the perfect. It is a hospital for the wounded. He carried in his own body the truth that holiness and suffering are not enemies but companions. He knew that the greatest pain is often the hidden one, the wound no one sees. And he believed to the end that the church would always be called to kneel, to confess, to be cleansed, to begin again. So when a pope kneels and confesses a hidden wound and asks the world for pardon, he is not betraying the church. He is doing the very thing the friar gave his blood to teach. Remember the years Padre Pio spent silenced, accused, watched, forbidden the altar he loved. He did not defend himself by hiding the truth. He defended himself by enduring it. And now a pope refused to hide the truth of the church's own past and instead endures the shame of it openly in the sight of the whole world. The friar taught the church to stop pretending its wounds were not there, to stop covering the blood with a glove, to let the hidden thing be seen so that it could finally begin to heal. The faithful who connect these two moments are not foolish. They are listening to a deeper music. They are hearing the same melody played in two different centuries, a wounded saint, a kneeling pope, and between them the long patient mercy of God, who does not abandon his church but purifies it, wound by wound, confession by confession. This is what it means for you tonight, watching alone with the lamp low. You have lived long enough to know that the church you love is made of human hands, and that human hands have done both holy and terrible things. Perhaps that has troubled you. Perhaps you have wondered how to keep faith in an institution that has so much to answer for. Padre Pio gives you the answer in his own scarred body. You do not keep faith because the church is clean. You keep faith because the church is being cleansed. You keep faith because the same God who let a humble friar bleed for 50 years is still at work, still drawing wounds into the light, still teaching popes to kneel. The friar of San Giovanni Rotondo never named the pope who would apologize to the world, but he prepared us for him. He showed us in blood and silence and the perfume of roses that the path to glory runs straight through the wound, that what is hidden will one day be confessed, that the church, like her Lord, must pass through the cross before she rises. You are not watching the end of something tonight. You are watching the slow, aching, beautiful purification of the oldest family on earth. And you, kneeling in your own quiet room, are part of it. The friar saw souls one at a time. He would have seen yours. He would have known the wound you carry that no one else knows about, the shoulder wound of your own life. The pain you have never told a living soul. Bring it into the light. That is the whole secret. That is what the bleeding friar lived to say. That is what the kneeling Pope is finally saying to the world. Pray, hope, and do not worry. Those were the friar's own words, the ones he gave to everyone who came to him afraid. Pray, hope, and do not worry. The God who held him through 50 years of pain is holding the church still, and he is holding you. The doors of the little confessional are long closed now. The friar is gone to his reward. But the question he leaves us is still open, still waiting in the dark for each of us to answer. What is the hidden wound you have never confessed? And are you ready, at last, to bring it home?